The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the family car as it cruised down the highway. It was supposed to be the perfect family vacation, the kind everyone dreams about, the kind where families bond, laughter fills the air, and memories are made. For the protagonist, this was supposed to be their moment, the chance to finally feel like part of the family, to be accepted and loved. But, as always, their hope was about to be shattered. Growing up, the protagonist had always known there was something different about their relationship with their mother. While other children basked in the warmth of their mother's love and support, the protagonist was left to fend for themselves emotionally. The mother, distant and often cold, would occasionally throw them a smile, but it was always fleeting, always shallow. There was no warmth behind her words, no real connection. As a child, the protagonist had longed for affection, but instead they found themselves constantly struggling to earn their mother's attention. It was never enough. Nothing they did could fill the emptiness that lingered between them. From a young age, they were taught to suppress their emotions, to hide their hurt. Any attempt to connect, to bridge the gap between them, was met with indifference or, at times, outright cruelty. Flashbacks of their childhood flooded their mind. Their mother snapping at them for something trivial, like spilling a drink or forgetting to clean up after themselves. The words were harsh, cutting through their fragile sense of self-worth. And when they tried to reach out, to seek solace in their mother's embrace, they were met with cold shoulders. Each rejection, each cruel word, etched a deep scar into the protagonist's heart, though they tried to ignore it, pretending everything was fine, pretending they were just like everyone else. But on that day, the day of the family vacation, the weight of those years of emotional neglect would come crashing down. As they packed their bags into the car, their mother's voice rose in irritation. "Are you really sure you need all that stuff?" she snapped. "We don't need any of your dead weight." The word stung, but the protagonist stayed silent, shrugging it off as best they could. They had learned over the years to ignore the slights, to push their feelings deep down. But this time it was different. When the family arrived at their destination, something shifted. The mother's mood darkened, and soon the protagonists found themselves on the receiving end of yet another cruel blow. With no warning, their mother yanked their suitcase out of the trunk, dragging it across the gravel. "You're a dead weight," she yelled, her voice harsh, unforgiving. "No one here needs you." The words felt like a knife to the heart, and for a moment time stood still. Standing in the parking lot, staring at their discarded suitcase on the road, the protagonist felt a deep, unbearable humiliation. Every ounce of hope they had for their family, every shred of love they had longed for, evaporated in that instant. The suitcase wasn't just an item tossed aside. It was a symbol of everything they had endured, everything they had tried so desperately to ignore. They had been discarded, rejected, no longer wanted. This moment, this single act of cruelty, marked a turning point. The protagonist could no longer pretend. The illusion of family, of love, was shattered. And in that moment, as they stood alone on the roadside, they made a silent vow to never return, to walk away, to prove to themselves and to their mother that they were worth more than the disdain she had shown them for so long. The air was thick with tension as the protagonists stood frozen in the parking lot, the weight of their mother's words sinking deeper into their soul with each passing second. The once familiar, comforting scent of the family vacation spot now felt suffocating. There was no warmth in the air, no joy to be found. The scene around them seemed surreal, like a nightmare from which they couldn't wake up. Family members continued to chatter, oblivious to the pain unfolding in front of them. But for the protagonist, time had slowed down, and everything felt painfully clear. The suitcase lay in the dust at their feet, a physical manifestation of the emotional rejection they had just endured. The humiliation was complete. It wasn't just that their mother had thrown their belongings on the ground like trash. It wasn't just the harsh words, the venom in her voice that felt like it was tearing them apart. It was the realization that this was it. There would be no apology. There would be no remorse. There was only cold indifference. "Are you going to just stand there like an idiot?" Their mother's voice cut through the stillness, her words laced with disgust. "You're ruining this trip. We don't need you here." The protagonist's body trembled with a mix of disbelief and anger. How had it come to this? They had spent their entire life trying to earn their mother's approval, trying to be someone she could love. But no matter how hard they tried, it was never enough. This moment, this public humiliation, felt like the final confirmation that they would never be enough for her. The rest of the family watched in awkward silence, most of them pretending not to notice, as though it wasn't happening. Some shifted uncomfortably, others just looked away. But not a single person stepped in to stop it. Not a single person came to their defense. The protagonist stood there, feeling smaller with each passing second, like an invisible weight was pressing down on them, pushing them to the ground. The silence from the family members around them felt deafening. The anger bubbled up, mixing with the hurt that had been simmering for years. They wanted to scream. They wanted to lash out, to throw something back at their mother. But they knew better. The protagonist had learned a long time ago that there was no use in fighting for someone who wouldn't even fight for them. They had always been the one to bend, to compromise, to apologize, even when they were the one wronged. But not today. Today, something inside them snapped. "Just leave me alone," they muttered, their voice low and strained. "I'm not staying here." And with that, they turned away from the group, not sparing another glance at their mother or the family. Every part of them screamed to stay, to argue, to try to make them see how much they had been hurt. But deep down, they knew that it wouldn't change anything. The protagonist's mind was made up. This was it. The final straw. There was no coming back from this. As they walked away, the voices of their family faded behind them. They could hear their mother's shouts, but it was like the sound was coming from a distant place, as if it didn't belong to them anymore. Each step they took was a step away from a life they no longer wanted. The protagonist didn't even look back when they reached their car. They didn't even hesitate. They just drove, the road stretching out before them, the weight of the humiliation still pressing heavily on their chest. They had no destination, no clear path forward. But they knew one thing for certain. They would never return to that toxic, suffocating place. The humiliation was complete, but something else was brewing inside them now, something that had been waiting to surface for years. They didn't need their family's approval anymore. They didn't need their mother's love. What they needed was to find themselves, to prove to themselves that they were worthy, no matter how many times they had been discarded. And they swore, deep in their heart, that they would show them all. The hurt would turn into strength, and the humiliation would become the fire that would drive them to rise above everything they had been told they couldn't do. The days following that vacation were filled with silence, an oppressive, suffocating silence. The protagonist returned home, but the place felt different, as though they had outgrown it. The once familiar surroundings now seemed foreign, even haunting. There was no one to turn to, no family to confide in. The world felt as if it had been drained of all its color, leaving them with nothing but the cold reality of their isolation. For the first time in their life, they found themselves alone, not just physically, but emotionally as well. The anger from the humiliation that had been thrown onto the road began to shift. It was no longer just rage at the mother or the family. It wasn't just about the cruelty that had been inflicted. It was about something deeper, something that the protagonist had never truly understood before, their own sense of self-worth. For so long, they had measured their value by the love and approval of their family, especially their mother. But now, with nothing left but the pain of rejection, they were forced to reckon with the fact that they had never truly known who they were outside of their family's judgment. Days turned into weeks, and the protagonist found solace in solitude. They spent time reflecting on their childhood, piecing together the moments that had shaped their sense of inadequacy. There were times when the past felt like a weight they couldn't shake off. But slowly, through the quiet moments, they began to understand something crucial. They had been seeking validation from the wrong places, looking for love in the places that could never give it to them. They had been searching for something from their mother that she would never be able to offer. The first small step towards healing came when they realized they didn't need anyone else's approval to be worthy. They began to focus on themselves, on their own growth. It wasn't about proving their mother or the family wrong anymore. It was about proving something to themselves. For the first time in their life, they started to make decisions based on their own desires and needs. They set goals, not because others expected them to, but because they wanted to create a life that felt true to who they were. The journey wasn't easy. It was filled with moments of doubt, times when the protagonist felt as though the weight of their past was too much to overcome. But each time they stumbled, they picked themselves up with a new sense of resolve. Slowly, they began to see the fruits of their labor. They found themselves excelling in their career, discovering a passion for work they had never known. The world around them started to come into focus, and they realized that they were capable of more than they had ever given themselves credit for. They had always been strong, but now they had a strength that wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. The world was no longer a place where they felt invisible, where their worth was determined by someone else. They were beginning to build something of their own, not from the expectations of others, but from the quiet resolve that had been growing inside them. And then something began to change, slowly at first, but with a certainty that the protagonist couldn't ignore. They started to believe in themselves, truly believe in their own worth. It wasn't the loud, arrogant kind of belief that came from showing off or seeking validation. It was a quiet confidence that came from knowing who they were, from understanding their own strength. It was during this period of growth that the protagonist began to see the path forward. The foundation they had built wasn't just about career success or financial stability. It was about becoming someone who could stand on their own, without the need for anyone else's approval. The pain of the past was still there, lingering in the background, but it no longer had control over them. Instead, it had become a part of their story, one that they had learned to accept and even use as fuel for their own transformation. With each passing day, the protagonist grew stronger, more focused, and more determined. They were no longer the person who had been humiliated on the side of the road. They were someone new, someone who was ready to take on the world. And in the quiet moments of reflection, the protagonist realized that this journey, this transformation, had been the greatest revenge of all. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about proving to themselves that they were worth more than the treatment they had endured. The journey had just begun, and the future was theirs to create. As the months turned into years, the protagonist's life began to take a shape they had never imagined possible. The journey from humiliation to success was not a smooth one, but with every obstacle, they found a deeper resolve to push forward. The pain of the past became a constant companion, but it also served as the fire that fueled their ambition. Every rejection, every moment of doubt, every time they fell, those were the moments that shaped them, taught them how to stand back up and keep moving forward. The protagonist's growth wasn't just about learning new skills or advancing in their career. It was about developing a mindset that was unshakable, about understanding that the path to success was paved with moments of struggle and sacrifice. They threw themselves into their work with the kind of dedication that left no room for distractions. Their focus was no longer on the approval of others. It was no longer about proving their mother or their family wrong. It was about creating a life they could be proud of, one that was entirely their own. The road to success wasn't easy. There were times when it felt like the world was conspiring against them, when it seemed like no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't catch a break. But they refused to let these setbacks define them. Instead, they used those moments to fuel their drive, to sharpen their skills, to work harder. Every no they received, every failure, only made them more determined to succeed. And slowly, the results began to show. Opportunities started to appear where there had once been only closed doors. A chance encounter, a networking opportunity, a business venture. These were the moments that would change everything. With each new opportunity, the protagonist seized it with the confidence of someone who had learned the hard way that nothing in life came without effort. They weren't looking for a handout, but for a chance to prove themselves, to show that they had the talent and the resilience to make something of themselves. It wasn't long before the protagonists found themselves in a position of power, leading a team, building something meaningful from the ground up. They had become a millionaire, not just in wealth, but in the confidence and self-respect they had earned through years of struggle and growth. The success wasn't just about the material wealth that now surrounded them, but about the person they had become in the process. They were no longer the same person who had been thrown out onto the road, humiliated and broken. They were someone who had built their own empire, someone who had learned that the greatest form of revenge was silent, dignified strength. And with this success, a new realization began to form within the protagonist. They no longer needed their family's validation. For years, they had longed for approval, for the love and acceptance that had always felt just out of reach. But now, they understood that their worth didn't depend on anyone else's perception of them. They had earned their place in the world, and they were ready to stand tall without looking back. The protagonist's newfound confidence wasn't just about the financial success they had achieved, but about the sense of self they had discovered along the way. They no longer felt like a failure or an outsider. They had become someone who knew their own worth, someone who had achieved success on their own terms. The dream that had once seemed out of reach was now their reality, and it was a reality that no one, not even their family, could take away from them. But success wasn't the end of the journey. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter, one where the protagonist no longer needed anyone's approval to feel complete. The road ahead was still uncertain, but with every step forward, they knew they had the strength to face whatever came next. They had built themselves from the ground up, and now nothing could hold them back. The journey to success had been long and painful, but as the protagonist stood at the threshold of their newfound life, there was something pulling them back, something deep inside that refused to let go. 2 years had passed since they walked away from their family, humiliated and broken. In those years, they had built a life that was their own, one that was free from the toxic influence of their past. But now, a sense of unfinished business lingered in their heart. The past had never truly left them, and as much as they had grown, as much as they had achieved, there was one question that remained. Could they ever truly move on without confronting the source of their pain? It wasn't about reconciliation. The protagonist didn't expect an apology, nor did they want one. What they craved was closure, the ability to walk away with their dignity intact, knowing that they had done everything they could to heal the wounds of their past. The decision to return wasn't an easy one. There were moments of doubt, moments when they questioned whether they were ready to face the people who had caused them so much pain. But deep down, they knew they had to do this. They needed to confront their mother, not to seek forgiveness, but to claim the final piece of their own power. The emotional turmoil was overwhelming as they thought about walking back into that house, the place where their life had unraveled so many years ago. Memories flooded their mind, memories of rejection, of cruel words, of feeling unwanted and unloved. Yet, in these moments of introspection, the protagonist realized how far they had come. They had survived the harshest of storms, and now they were stronger than ever. This wasn't about revenge. It was about finding peace with the past. It was about proving to themselves that they no longer needed the approval of the people who had never seen their worth. The protagonist's internal struggle was real. They had spent years building a life in silence, relying on their own strength and resilience. To return to that house, to face their mother, felt like stepping back into a world they had long since escaped. Yet, the pull of closure was undeniable. They could no longer carry the weight of this unfinished chapter in their life. As they sat in their car, staring at the familiar house that had once been their home, a mixture of emotions flooded them. Fear, anger, sadness, and yet something else. A sense of calm. For the first time in years, they felt ready. Ready to face the past. Ready to let go of the hurt that had kept them chained for so long. This moment wasn't about making their mother feel bad. It wasn't about extracting some kind of revenge that would give them temporary satisfaction. It was about walking back into that house with the knowledge that they had made it on their own. They were no longer the person they had once been. They were a different person now, stronger and more at peace with themselves. As they turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, the protagonist knew that no matter what happened inside that house, they had already won. They had found the strength to walk away, and now they were finding the strength to return, not for the family they once knew, but for the person they had become. With every step they took toward that front door, they were one step closer to releasing the last remnants of the past that had held them captive for so long. The door creaked as the protagonist stepped into the old house. It was eerily familiar, yet everything had changed. The same smell of pine wood and old furniture, the same wallpaper that had witnessed countless moments of both love and neglect. But now, standing in the doorway, the protagonist felt a strange sense of peace, the kind that only comes when you know you've outgrown the space that once defined you. Inside, their mother was sitting on the couch, her eyes wide in surprise as she looked up. She hadn't expected anyone, especially not the child she had discarded so carelessly. For a moment, the room was silent. The air was thick with tension, a sense of inevitability hanging in the space between them. The protagonist could feel the weight of the years that had passed, the years of pain and resentment, pressing down on them. But they didn't flinch. This wasn't about anger. This wasn't about humiliation. This was about closure. With a steady hand, the protagonist reached into their jacket and pulled out the contract. Proof of the success they had built on their own. Proof of the life they had created. Their mother's eyes narrowed as she saw it, her confusion turning to a flicker of fear. The protagonist didn't say anything at first. They simply held up the contract and placed it on the table between them. The silence stretched out, heavy with the unspoken words that had never been said. Then, calmly, almost too calmly, the protagonist spoke. "Now, this place is mine. You have 48 hours to leave." The words were soft, measured, but the weight of them hit harder than any shout could. It was a statement, not a threat. A fact, not a request. Their mother's face drained of color as she processed what was happening. The disbelief in her eyes was palpable, the shock evident. She had never expected this. She had never imagined that the child she had dismissed, the child she had cast aside so easily, would come back in such a way, powerful, confident, and in control. The protagonist didn't wait for a response. There was no need for words, no need to justify the decision. The truth was in their actions. As they turned to leave, they couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction, not because of what they had done, but because they had done it with grace, dignity, and strength. They had won, and it was in the silence that they felt their victory. The days that followed the confrontation felt surreal to the protagonist. Walking away from that moment, they didn't feel the rush of triumph or the pleasure of revenge that most might expect in such situations. Instead, there was a calmness, a profound silence that settled deep inside them. It wasn't the satisfaction of seeing their mother's shock and confusion, nor the thrill of having the power to make a decision that they could have only dreamed of in the past. It was something more substantial. The realization that they had finally severed the chains that had bound them to a past filled with emotional manipulation, neglect, and rejection. As the 48 hours passed, the protagonist reflected on the years spent in the shadow of their mother's cruelty. There had been so many moments in their life when they had craved her approval, her love. For so long, they had believed that somehow, somewhere, there had to be a way to win her over, to be the child she wanted them to be, to earn their place in a family that had always made them feel like an outsider. The weight of her words, the sting of her rejection, had never fully left them. But now, after all the growth, after the years of struggle and hardship, they saw things differently. The protagonist could finally see the truth in the situation. Their mother's rejection had nothing to do with them. It wasn't about their worth, their potential, or their abilities. It had always been about her own insecurities, her need to control, and her refusal to acknowledge anyone who didn't fit into her narrow view of the world. The protagonist had spent too many years allowing her to dictate their sense of self-worth. But they had grown beyond that. They had found their own value. As the final hours of the 48-hour deadline ticked away, the protagonist felt an overwhelming sense of peace. They had done what was necessary, not for the sake of revenge, but for closure, for healing, and for personal growth. It wasn't about punishing their mother. It was about reclaiming their own life. The house that once symbolized rejection now symbolized freedom. The protagonist had become the person they had always been meant to be, someone strong, independent, and capable of moving on, no matter what the past had thrown at them. The emotional weight that had once been so heavy now felt like a distant memory, a fading echo of a time when the protagonist believed they were powerless. The scars of their childhood, the pain of abandonment, were still there, but they were no longer the defining parts of their story. They had rewritten their narrative. They had learned the most important lesson of all. The only validation they needed was their own. When the final hour arrived and the protagonist received confirmation that the house had been vacated, they stood in silence for a moment, letting it all sink in. No cheers, no shouting. Just a deep breath and the quiet knowledge that they had walked away from their past and into a future filled with their own possibilities. There was no need to look back, for they had already won. As the protagonist walked away from the house for the last time, a profound sense of peace settled over them. It was not the kind of peace that comes from an easy victory, nor from having the last word. This peace was quiet, earned through years of struggle, growth, and reflection. Every step they took away from the house symbolized the steps they had taken away from the past that had defined them for so long. They had come so far from the broken child who had been cast aside and humiliated to the strong, independent person they had become. The weight of the years of all the emotional neglect and cruelty they had endured no longer held any power over them. It was as if each step away from that place stripped away the remnants of their past, the pain and rejection that had once defined their every move. In its place was a quiet strength, a silent knowing that they had triumphed not by fighting back, but by simply choosing to move on. For the first time in years, they felt free. Not just free from their mother, but free from the need for her validation, free from the chains of a toxic family dynamic. The emotional scars remained, but they no longer controlled the protagonist's life. They had learned to rely on themselves, to build a future on their own terms, and in doing so, they had reclaimed their power. They didn't need to say goodbye, didn't need to utter one final, scathing remark. The silence was enough. The protagonist had learned that sometimes the most powerful form of revenge was not in the words spoken, but in the actions taken. Walking away from the situation, from the family that had never truly supported them, was the ultimate act of defiance. It was the most dignified form of revenge. As the protagonist walked into the unknown, a smile tugged at the corners of their lips. They had made peace with their past, found the strength to leave behind a chapter that no longer served them, and now they were free to write a new one. It wasn't the revenge they had once imagined in their darkest moments. It was better. It was peace, self-respect, and the knowledge that their future was entirely in their hands. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply walking away and never looking back. With that thought, the protagonist continued down the road, not towards a future defined by others, but towards one built on their own terms.